waiting room so we can officially start. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome everyone joining this workshop on integration of environmental linkages in COVID-19 recovery plans. My name is Paula Padrino, and I am the coordinator of UN Environment's COVID-19 project, and it's really my pleasure to be moderating today's event. The COVID-19 pandemic has evolved not only from a major public health crisis, but also a major economic and social crisis as well. The socio-economic impact is enormous, with long-lasting repercussions on people, businesses, and governments. The pandemic is also linked with global environmental issues, such as biodiversity loss, climate change, air and water pollution, and waste management, impacting the future well-being of societies around the world. The recovery plans that governments are not putting in place have the potential to create a recovery that is both green and inclusive. This can create opportunities for income, jobs, and growth, and at the same time accelerate action on medium and long-term environmental goals. Countries around the world are looking for guidance on recovery planning for a post-pandemic life. While health and economy are the traditional focus for such recovery planning exercises, we believe that environmental elements must also be included in such recovery strategies in order for us to have a holistic approach. Stimulus packages and investments should not only support economies and livelihoods recovery, but at the same time should facilitate the environmental sustainability, strengthen resilience to climate impacts, improve pathways to renewable energy, just to mention a few. This workshop is conducted jointly by UNEP and UNDP, and we will address the environmental linkages of COVID-19 impacts faced by member states. And we will try to provide some guidance on the process and methodology to be followed in order to incorporate such environmental elements and cross-cutting issues into the recovery planning process of states. In addition, in this workshop, we will also present the case studies of South Africa and Zambia. So before passing the floor to our first speaker, I'd like to encourage participants to submit all of your questions at any point using the chat button on your dashboards. This workshop will last for an hour and a half, and the way that we have structured the session is that we will first go through the presentations of our invited panelists, and at the end we will have some time allocated for discussions and questions and answers. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Rita Misal, who is the Global Recovery Advisor for UNDP's Crisis Bureau. She is currently based in the New York office. Rita is a post-disaster recovery practitioner with over 20 years of experience in the field of disaster recovery, and is currently leading UNDP's global efforts in conducting COVID's recovery needs assessment. So Rita, very welcome. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, UNEP colleagues, particularly Murali, for inviting us to be here in this session. We are very pleased to be participating and partnering together with UNEP in this very, very important initiative of addressing the environmental impacts of COVID-19. UNDP, as you would know, has been tasked by the Secretary General's office to conduct socioeconomic recovery needs assessment impact assessment in all the states in countries. And as a result of that, we've been extending technical support and leadership to country offices, to all UN agencies working with the government to develop COVID-19 recovery plans. So my presentation today would focus on how we came about doing this COVID-19 recovery plans, or COVID-19 recovery needs assessment, as this title says, how we use, what is the methodology we use, and then to delve a little bit deeper into some country examples about how we kind of integrate environmental linkages in COVID-19 recovery plans. So that would be the focus of my presentation today. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'm not sure how many of you are aware, UNDP, the UN system, the World Bank, and the European Union in 2008 signed a joint declaration committing themselves to support governments in post-crisis assessments and recovery planning. A decade after that, in 2018, when we have done a review of the work together, that jointly done by agencies together, we had actually developed a whole set of tools and guidelines. We've developed a training capacities with different government officials. And more importantly, we have refined the methodology for its application in different kinds of disasters. But this did not end there. Its application has also been used in different contexts where disaster did not happen. Let's say the last example was Ebola recovery, where this kind of tool was also applied. And then recently, when the pandemic hit, we thought about trying to adapt the tool for COVID-19 recovery as well. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. So when you hear about CRNA or COVID-19 recovery needs assessment, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what we have done so far in terms of establishing the global practice of post-disaster needs assessment and recovery and peace building needs assessment. If you look at this particular slides, we have about 70 countries odd in which post-disaster needs assessment has been completed. And recently, very recently, since last 2020, March 2020, we've been actually having different important countries where we've started working on adapting this whole methodology for COVID-19 as well. So I think this was the first time when we, all UN agencies together joined together with the European Union to look at the methodology and see how the methodology can not only be suited for disasters, but also suited for this current crisis that we are facing, which is probably the most biggest crisis that any government has faced or any international partner has ever faced till date. So that's how we started out with a small group of people, started working on a short guidance note, and I'll show you in the next slide how we have adapted it. Next slide, please. So if you are a little bit familiar with what we call a post-disaster needs assessment, by the title itself already denotes that we are working in a post context. That means after the disaster has taken place, we do a needs assessment. Whereas with the pandemic, there is no after or there is no post. We are all aware that it started somewhere in March 2020 or earlier than that, but with March 2020, it kind of was globally spread around, and it still continues. We have been seen peaks and troughs in different countries. The first wave, second wave in many countries. Now we are saying in third wave in many countries. So in this particular assessment tool, what we have done is we have removed the element of post, and we are saying it's a kind of a continuing recovery needs assessment, because in the first wave, there was a high impact. We do an assessment, start recovery, but recovery doesn't end at any point of time soon. We are seeing a second wave, and then we need to assess what is the impact of the second wave, and then we continue to do a second assessment and plan further recovery steps or strengthen the recovery that started in the first phase. The second thing that we also do look at is that, you know, in a typical disaster, you would realize that the biggest impact is on big sectors that have infrastructure, strong infrastructure. It could be roads and bridges. It could be irrigation systems. It could be, big school buildings, hospital buildings. Infrastructure is hardest hit in either an earthquake, volcanic eruption, or perhaps housing is the other big sector that is hit. Whereas in a pandemic, we do not see that, it's not visible. The physical impacts that you would see in a disaster is never visible. It is the socio-economic aspects of people's lives and livelihoods that is affected most. And therefore, our focus will no longer center in a CRNA, in COVID-19 recovery needs assessment, in any infrastructure elements of it, but rather on how people have been affected. And therefore, what we looked at the different sectors based on how economy has been affected, how social issues have been affected, and then we focused on that. And we linked it very much to the SDGs pillars of SDGs pillars framework, which is about health first, looking at livelihoods, especially informal and small-term livelihoods, looking at social protection issues, looking at how equity can be addressed, and also at the end of it, so to ensure that, we are having a greening of recovery. And so these are the elements that we have focused on when we looked at the CRNA. I'll delve a little bit deeper into the sector assessment methodology in my next slide, but to talk about and also talk about green recovery and building back better. So typically, as I mentioned just before in a slide, that we normally would have to go through a lot of infrastructure related recovery or reconstruction after a disaster. But here, if you look at it, a typical PDNA post-disaster needs assessment will look at the slew of sectors that is a lot infrastructure based, such as housing, culture, community infrastructure. My apologies, we have a severe power cut here because of a lightning striking us. And so my video capacities are limited. I hope you will excuse me for that. I do not have video capacities at this point of time. But Paula, can you confirm you can hear me?
I confirm, Rita, we can hear you clearly.
Thank you very much. We had a lightning strike today, talking of disasters, and the power systems in this entire area, in fact, has gone down. So we're running on battery, and that's also come down now. So my apologies for that. But what I would like to go back to is the sectors that we look at in COVID-19. Here you see we have cut down housing, we have cut down community infrastructure. In several ways, we did not look very closely at the infrastructure elements of telecommunication or transport, or the infrastructure elements of, let's say, education. What we were rather looking at, if you take the education, is how many schools or how many children were out of school because of the pandemic, how many school days they have lost, what is the impact on children's life, and what is the impact on teachers, how did the education system stand up to the new tests of trying to continue education through the pandemic by using different methodologies. What are the different kinds of systems they adopted, and how did it work? So I think there was a complete change in the way which we started looking at a particular sector. And same thing for health. Instead of looking at hospital buildings, we were looking at health services. As you can see, that is the most critical element of it. Why we're looking at health services, we're not looking at how they respond to the pandemic only, but we're also looking at what services, regular services of the health system that has completely derailed due to the pandemic, such as maternity health services, vaccination, ordinary vaccination services, non-communicable disease services. Everything at some time was completely stopped in several countries and could not start. But coming to some other critical new issues that we started to look at. One is, as we understand, social protection across all countries became one big form of response to countries to kind of help people to cope with the pandemic. And so social protection mechanisms or social assistance programs, social inclusion programs were either expanded, or either they were scaled up, or many more beneficiaries were brought into the fore of a social protection mechanism. And so our analysis focused very much on this. Earlier, we never thought about social protection or social inclusion as a sector that we will look into an assessment, but this is relatively new, and this is a big focus. And then we have two important elements that we call the umbrella sector assessments, which we call the human impact. Very critical, just because the human impact focuses on most vulnerable groups, the impact on them, the impact on women, children, people with disabilities, people with HIV/AIDS, but also looking at the issues of gender, looking at the issues of livelihoods on people, and the overall poverty impact on people. But coming to the two important elements of this particular webinar, which is looking at how environment has impacted the pandemic, or the other way around, how environmental impacts have affected the whole range of sectors of people in the pandemic. So in the context of the pandemic, we've noticed, you will see the rest of the presentation from other presenters is focused a lot on waste management. I will go more into other sectoral issues that we have seen, and how UNDP, through the COVID-19 recovery needs assessment, had tried to integrate environmental issues and also draw attention to the larger emergency of climate change through using the pandemic as an opportunity to address environmental impacts. My next slide, please. So a typical way we look at the assessment methodology, we will not go into details here. When we do an assessment for the COVID-19 recovery needs assessment, we follow 5 steps. And the first step is to understand what was the situation of a country or a particular sector before the pandemic. And that helps us understand let's say, the overall, if I was taking the example of the education sector again, what was the profile of children? How many children actually went to school? What kind of facilities, what kind of teaching methodologies were used before the pandemic? That's the kind of analysis we would do sector-wise, including what were the typical policy initiatives that were taken, what was the long-term plan for development of that particular sector, what was the annual budget of the government towards education of total of the GDP. All this is analyzed because we want to understand what was before, because after the pandemic, things changed completely. And so to do an analysis of what happened after, which we do the COVID-19 effects, it's important to understand what was before so that we can do a comparative analysis. And here we look at not only the impact on children, on the dropout rate, on school feeding children, school feeding systems, but also analyze how effective the new systems that the education department and ministry has undertaken to provide education to children over this pandemic period during the emergency or lockdown, be it through digital ways, be it through radio, be it through TV, or trying to reach children also with lessons at home or wherever they are. So that's one part of it. The second part is to also look at how much economic loss a particular sector has undertaken, say education ministry, just by not being able to provide education in the time after the pandemic. In the third step, we look at the macroeconomic impact analysis because of education in the long term. And you would have read many articles about it now. In many countries, students may have lost between 5 to 6 years of schooling because of not going to regular class now. Either they drop out completely or they have completely gone back. And I think the whole education system is a good example of how everything can go haywire, right from primary school to the end. So let me move on to how do we apply in the next slide. How do we apply it in the pandemic, the environmental impact? So as I said, that it is a socio-economic crisis. We just cannot look at environment in a silo. We are looking at better air quality, we're looking at better water quality, effective waste management, and better biodiversity protection. And how do we do this? We recognize that this system is interconnected. They are not separate. The waste system is not separate from health. Health system is not separate from water and sanitation. Water and sanitation is not separate from people's housing. So I think the recognition that all these systems are interconnected, and therefore if a government has to respond to an environmental risk or a climate risk or a social risk, the governance system must look at the interconnectedness of it. And finally, when you use stimulus packages, the response packages of government is not only to look at a health risk or a social risk or an economic risk, but to look at risk in its totality, which is about social, environment, and economic risk. Next slide, please. So typically in each government, the key strategy for recovery has been to address first the lives of people. Then secondly is through social insurance and assistance to protect the most vulnerable. The third is to ensure food security. The fourth is to give digital capacities, expand digital capacities. Fifth is to do livelihood assistance. And then, of course, there are those long-term goals of a government, that is improve infrastructure, supply chain management, reimagine space. Now, when you look at it from the environmental lens, instead of health and protection and food security, all of it being a separate siloed approaches for response, all of this to come together so that they make environmental sense. And I'll look at some of the examples that in the next slide. Can you go to the next slide? Yes, thank you. So there is this whole the whole opportunity to make everything green. By green, let me say activities that offer significant prospects is when you talk about job creation through ecosystem restoration, renewable energy, organic farming, and reskilling, right? These are a whole lot of things that can be done for economic recovery. But by looking at it through an environmental lens, we talk about how do we tweak the approaches of the fiscal stimulus packages, let's say in terms of job, and those who are in countries where they have, where the government has employment guarantee schemes. All of these jobs that are going to be given through the pandemic can be used only for ecosystem restoration, for regeneration of natural assets, for farming, for other natural, rebuilding of infrastructure in a much better way, whether it is fields and farms or different kinds of things. So using the entire resources only for greening things. The other thing is to look at, how do we reimagine, investments in such a in this particular time. We are looking at health infrastructure, the huge ramping up of health infrastructure because of the need for hospitals. Are we looking at how do we do really focus on renewable energy, on greening the building, on use of best resources? I'm not talking about waste management because everybody else is going to speak a little bit more about it. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'll just use this last slide to wrap up and give one or two examples. So the most important thing that I would like to summarize here is that with the pandemic, we have a critical opportunity to align with, our climate change related goals. One is everything that we do in COVID-19 recovery plans has to have this element of looking through green lens, be it job, be it infrastructure, be it reimagining spaces, be it subsidies to companies, be it the understanding of how industries will be supported, whether it is tourism or transport. All of it had to be looked at in a way in which how it can be environmental sound as well as friendly. Next is to reduce the biodiversity loss. You bring an awareness about building on changes in your behavior. Already people are very, very sure about, they do not want to go back to the same air quality it was before the pandemic. The exposure to living in very good air quality has also brought about a general awareness about how people can move and use urban spaces for making it much more, improving the quality of life, thus improving the quality of living as well. And also making sure that local production, local construction, local use of local materials is much more sustainable, particularly when supply chains are completely broken in a context of a pandemic. So overall, if we do these things, we will be already contributing to an environmentally sustainable world. And I hope that, all of us will be taking lessons from this and be advocates for this kind of approach to recovery, whether it is in COVID-19 or after a disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rita. This was a great overview, and sorry, I hope that we have more time in the Q&A to explore more these issues. I'll now move on to our second speaker of the day, considering we're a bit late in our schedule, Mr. Mike Cowing, Chief Technical Advisor of the Resilience to Disasters and Conflicts Global Support Branch. Mike is an internationally renowned waste management expert with more than 35 years of experience working in more than 60 countries around the world. Mike is currently leading UNEP's activities relating to High Prep and Ogoliland in the Niger Delta. And so without further ado, Mike, the floor is all yours. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Paula. Can you just confirm that you can both hear and see me okay?
I confirm we can see you and hear you.
Okay, that's super. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to be talking briefly today about arguably one of the most vulnerable sectors in society, that being the informal waste sector. We'll have an overview looking at some of the roles and activities of that sector and underscoring the importance of why we need to be engaging with them in any post-COVID-19 recovery plan. So next slide, thanks very much. Okay, so just running over those again, we're going to do an overview of the sector and we're going to underscore the importance of engaging with this sector during our planning activities. Next slide, thanks. Okay, by way of a brief background, I've been working with the informal waste management sector around the globe now for probably in excess of 30 years. So I'm drawing on that material, but also there's a lot of organizations now active in this sector doing a lot of very good work, such as the Global Alliance of Waste Pickers and Women in Informal Employment Globalizing an Organization. So it's encouraging to note that there are these organizations which provide a platform and provide a voice for this sector of society. Next slide, thanks, Paula. Okay, that first thing to note is that the nature of employment of this sector is indeed that they are informally employed. The majority of the workforce are informally employed, up to 90% of which are within developing countries. And taken globally, we're talking about potentially 2 billion workers worldwide within the informal sector, of which the waste management sector is part of that broader informal sector. ILO recently estimated that livelihoods of up to 80% of informal workers have been seriously impacted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And other estimates, of which there are many, ILO also estimated that during just the first month of the pandemic, the informal sector globally experienced a 60% drop in income, with the highest impacts being in Africa and Asia. Next slide, thanks. So we're talking about an already very marginalized, very vulnerable sector of society, which has been further impacted by this global pandemic. The informal waste management sector specifically, there isn't internationally a great deal of information, accurate information regarding numbers and the demographics of waste pickers. And this is to do largely with the nature of the activities undertaken, that they are informal by nature. It's a seasonally variable undertaking. A lot of these people are on the periphery of society, perhaps have good reason to be nervous of figures of authority who might want to collect and generate such data, and they are geographically very widely dispersed throughout their work locations. So some reasons why we don't have a great deal of very accurate data, but there's a number of trends, a number of estimates, and back in 1988, the World Bank themselves estimated that up to 2% of the global population subsists by waste picking. So that alone tells us that we're talking about a very substantial number of people putting out a living through these activities. Okay, next slide, thank you. Again, talking about the informal waste sector, what are some of the factors that have caused this sector to grow so rapidly, some of which are rapid urbanization, particularly throughout the developing world. That's led to a very significant increase in waste generations generally, municipal waste within the urban centers, and demands for more waste management services, very often which the municipalities can't fund. There's a rule of thumb, an estimate that on average, municipalities in the developing world spend something like half of their operational budgets on waste management. So it's arguably one of the most expensive undertakings for municipalities. But that said, very often the level of waste collection is quite low as 50%, but generally in the range between 50 and 80%. Where we don't have adequate coverage of waste management services, collection, recycling, disposal, then the community themselves will often adopt harmful disposal practices, such as dumping waste in ravines, in open land, openly burning the waste. And this is where the informal sector come in and play a very important role for the broader society, in terms of they do pick up a lot of the slack in terms of waste management services. And in so doing, they're helping to minimize, helping to offset a lot of these more damaging environmental practices. Next slide, thanks. Now, providing assistance and investment into the informal sector is essential going forward in terms of recovery from COVID, if we're to achieve a more equitable economic recovery post-COVID. And very often, as I say, the informal waste management sector are operating on the periphery. They often don't have the voice, they often don't have the visibility which is merited. So one of the first important steps is just recognizing the importance that this sector contributes to broader society. And in recognizing that, it's an important first step, and it actually comes at no cost at all. So that's the important first step when we're looking at identifying and then wishing to engage with this informal sector. Next slide, thanks. Now, by the nature of their work, waste pickers are exposed to extremely difficult working environments. Very often there's an absence or a paucity of protective personal equipment, such as the basics, boots, gloves, and what have you. So they are routinely exposed to a high level of infection and a high level of injuries. Indeed, many of them suffer underlying health challenges prior to entering into the informal waste management sector. And these difficult working conditions, this exposure to risk, this exposure to infection has been exacerbated, has been compounded by the COVID-19 situation. And as we're all very much aware, the increase in waste generation, the increase in hazardous waste specific to the healthcare sector. Now, we've said that they're exposed to risk, they're exposed to ill health and injury, but sadly, they very often lack the financial resources, the funds, the savings to actually seek medical attention when they do get sick and they do get injured. Many continue to work because they can't afford either medical help, and they can't afford simply not to go to work, because it's very much funds generated on a daily basis to put food on the table to feed the extended family. Thank you. Next slide. So a big exposure to physical risk, but also exposure to mental health risk. We've heard a lot internationally about how lockdown and isolation has exacerbated a lot of mental health issues. Very much the case for the informal waste sector as well. In terms of lockdown has reduced significantly their opportunities to earn an income, to put food on the table. And this is contributing, proliferating mental health issues within the sector. And there are other related issues, such as an increase in domestic violence or anxiety about mounting debt and an inability to pay bills, for example, because as we've mentioned, the informal sector typically don't have access to savings or bank accounts. Next slide, thanks. Now, this situation is further contributed to as a result of the pandemic, that there's been a general decrease in the amount of recycling generally. Part of the reason being that waste management services have not been sustained to the level prior to that of the pandemic. There's been reductions in recycling. There were concerns early on about handling waste potentially for recycling because it could be a disease vector carrying, spreading the virus. Early on, it corresponded with a reduction in the oil price, which meant that virgin plastic very often became cheaper than recycled materials on the market, which was another financial disincentive to recycle, and in so doing, reducing the potential income for the waste pickers. So waste recycling has become less attractive, it's become less profitable. There is indeed reduced demand, which in turn leads to reduced prices. We have seen internationally a big increase in the amounts of recyclable material actually being dumped and or incinerated. So a lot of the material that previously went into the market now is actually being disposed of rather than being recycled. And all of this contributes to this mounting financial crisis facing the waste picking community. Right, thank you. We heard from our first speaker about concerns about schooling, about school dropout.
Mike, you're on mute.
Sorry, Mike. I would like to remind everyone to keep yourselves muted, please, because otherwise it interrupts our speakers. And sorry, Mike, I muted you by mistake.
That's not a problem. I wondered if that was a subtle cue to say that I've got 2 minutes remaining. But anyway, thank you for that.
Actually, I'll take the opportunity to say if you can wrap it up, then that would be great because we're running out of time.
So in the informal waste management sector, we're seeing high levels of children not attending school because of growing financial problems. Children within the sector are often being directed out of need to go to the waste sites to try and earn supplementary income to support the families. And again, there's been a spike and increase in domestic violence, again, particularly against children. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so we've looked at some of the problems, some of the issues. We've talked a little bit about the importance of this sector and the sort of services that it provides. And when we're talking about post-COVID, when we're planning for recovery, what are the sort of actions which could be initiated to help the informal sector? We're talking about making information available to them about COVID-19 and the necessary local responses. So this is operating at the local government level. Local government, municipalities could do more to help the waste sector, the informal waste sector, in terms of providing hand washing stations, clean water, liquid soap, providing the basics in terms of PPE, personal protective equipment, the minimum being gloves and boots, as we see from these pictures to the right-hand side there. This is typically the conditions and the absence of PPE that the individuals are working with. Next slide, thank you. Other things that potentially could be undertaken at the local level could be consideration of compensation for those individuals who do become sick from COVID-19. Many of the informal sector have fallen outside of the government financial assistance schemes. Many don't have bank accounts. Other things that could be considered at the municipal or local government level would be debt forgiveness as it relates to bill and rental charges. Many of the systems are extremely complicated and bureaucratic for these individuals to become documented, to become registered. These procedures could indeed be simplified. And we need to make sure that there's the inclusion of the waste picking community within discussions about recovery. And that would mean also in the sorts of post-crisis recovery activities that we've been talking about, particularly our first speaker, is about trying to ensure that we are identifying, engaging with, and talking to the informal waste management sector. Next slide, thank you very much. Again, now if we look to the national level, there could be things that would help their situation and could be thought about as we're planning recovery, is an acknowledgement of waste pickers, the fact that they are an essential frontline working group and that they do deserve special support and special recognition for the service that they do provide to the broader community. We could think about, as has been done in some countries, registration of informal workers, and in so doing, recognition of waste recycling, waste picking as an official occupation, rather than is sometimes the case seen as to be marginally criminal and high levels of, as it were, harassment from the authorities towards the waste pickers. And other such things would be removing barriers to joining national health insurance systems. Many of these individuals are on the outside of these schemes. Allowing them to join would be very much beneficial to them. Next slide, thank you. Other activities, it would be ensure sufficient and rapid access to testing and treatment, vaccinations, funding educational outreaches, and perhaps direct financial support. One example talked about often is the proposed billionaire tax in New York, whereby the most privileged, the wealthiest in society, pay additional tax. And these funds are specifically benchmarked to help the most disadvantaged in society, such as the waste pickers. Next slide, thank you. I think I'll move on in the interest of time. We'll keep going till we get to that final summary page. There we go. So in summary, what have we said? We have to recognize the tremendous service that waste pickers provide to the larger community, larger society. It is a growing phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that accounts for and supports millions of individuals globally, and many of whom are the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged in society. The waste management industry in particular and the informal sector specifically has been very heavily impacted by the ongoing pandemic. There is a reduced demand, reduced recycling activities, which have further exacerbated the financial situation of the waste pickers. And we need to ensure that we acknowledge them, that we are interacting and having dialogue with the informal sector. We must address this. And all efforts must be made to the extent possible to protect their physical, mental, and financial health. With that, Paula, I'll hand the microphone back to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mike. Wonderful presentation. It is my pleasure now to move on and pass the floor to Mr. Ravi Shankar, which is UNEP's Senior Project Advisor. Ravi is an environmental engineer based in Canada with over 30 years of experience on projects around the world, helping organizations and individuals strengthen their environmental and safety management capacities. As an advisor at UNEP, Ravi has worked on projects in many countries such as Nigeria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Uganda, Cote d'Ivoire, just to mention a few. Currently, Ravi is engaged in helping member states incorporate environmental linkages into their COVID-19 related recovery needs assessments. And he's also engaged in a series of trainings on COVID-19 related waste management. So without further ado, Ravi, welcome. I will now pass the mic to you. Over.
Thank you, Paula. I hope you can hear me and see me well.
Yes, I confirm.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I want to speak specifically about the overview of various environmental linkages and the methodology. Rita, as well as Mike, have provided a really good base in terms of the socioeconomic focus of the COVID recovery needs assessment and how they are trying to incorporate these environmental cross-cutting issues. Now, Mike has identified one specific area, which is the informal sector. So let's look at several other environmental linkages as well. So next slide, please. My presentation is going to look at the major environmental linkages and then how to approach and how to bring in these environmental issues into the ongoing COVID recovery needs assessment. And then a quick methodology in terms of how to proceed with needs assessment. And then I will talk about a new template that we have created to gather information for baseline analysis. Next slide, please. So the environmental linkages, Mike talked about the informal waste sector. And typically when people look at PDNA or COVID recovery needs assessment, they think about the healthcare waste management because, by now people know that there is an enormous increase in the healthcare waste because of the pandemic related response. And that is causing a major stress on the healthcare waste management activities. Now that is one of them, but there is more, right? The second part, again, people can easily picture is the urban sanitation management practices. When the pandemic hit and the lockdown hit, there was severe impact on the sanitation management practices, either because people were fewer, they were not being allowed to go work because of the pandemic lockdown, or even the facilities that are in the back end of the system were being stressed. So that is the urban sanitation management practices. So this is the second linkage. The third one is industrial pollution control. What happens in a pandemic, and especially in the recovery part of it, governments are quite interested in increasing the economic activity, economic recovery as quickly as possible. And when that happens, industrial pollution control rules and regulations that have been in place might be a tempting area to relax a little bit so that the economic recovery, the industrial recovery can happen quickly. But when that happens, the pollution control mechanisms that were in place before the pandemic would be relaxed, and therefore we can expect air, water, soil contamination to increase. So one has to keep that also in mind as one of the environmental linkages. Then the pandemic impact on land use. Because of the lockdown and because of the pandemic, there is a major stress on the land use. For example, previously protected areas may be under pressure to be converted to farmland, or people may go and access the protected areas vegetation in order to provide for firewood, or wetlands could be transformed in order to have settlement area. Those kinds of challenges for land use will have to be considered also as an environmental linkage. On management of biospheres and national parks, we have a lot of protected areas that governments may have assigned in the past, which would have counted on the tourism income that's coming in. Now, with the pandemic and lockdown, all of those incomes have been severely hit, which means that there is additional pressure for the governments and for these national parks and protected areas to somehow generate income to sustain themselves. And how would they do that? There is a certain amount of pressure to dig into those natural resources that are there in the protected area. So that's another thing. Next slide, please. Now, looking at the linkage on food security and resource-based living. This is, again, the cross-cutting aspect is if people are in, for example, in an urban setting, if there is lockdown, they don't have any means of livelihood. So that means they are under pressure to go and get food from wherever they can. And they don't have they may have reduced access to fuel. That means they may have to go to the various protected areas or other areas which they were not considering in the past in order to get fuel. So there is a major environmental impact on food security as well as resource-based livelihood. That is something that has to be considered in the needs assessment. Next one is internal displacement of peoples. Now, we have seen this already in many countries where, because of the lockdown, people stuck in the urban centers may have to be or may be forced to move back to the rural areas or villages where they came from, which means there is a certain amount of movement, migration, internal migration going from urban centers to the rural areas. The other way is when the economics allow it, or because of the lack of healthcare facilities in rural areas, there may be migration towards the urban centers, looking for these kinds of facilities. And when that happens, the reverse migration also happens. So when these migrations happen, there is a considerable amount of stress because they will have to stay somewhere in between on their way, or they may suddenly go to a place where the population may double because of all these displaced peoples. So there is a certain pressure on the environment, on the surrounding environment, whether it's water supply, waste management, even protected areas, or even just vegetation all around. People needing to settle down in some places, so they would, this is the example of wetlands is a good one for this, where they would drain the wetlands so that they can make more space for settlement. So these are the challenges with internal displacement of people. Now, in addition to that, the humanitarian response activities for these displacement peoples, the internal refugees, that means that they will have to have ad hoc or emergency shelters need to be provided. And when there are a lot of people in a particular area which do not have the kind of infrastructure that is needed, the surrounding environment gets stressed quite a bit. And we see that in disaster, post-disaster situations. And we see the same thing in the COVID recovery aspect as well. So this component has to be considered in the needs assessment. And the last one is on climate change related policies and efforts. Now, we all know that slowly the climate change related regulations and policies are strengthening around the world. And there are treaties and agreements that are coming into place either between countries or multilaterally. However, because of the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, these policies may, again, just like the environmental regulations, may be an area where the leaders of the country may be looking at this to be either ignored or pushed a little bit or diluted. Now, as environmental professionals, as people who are involved in the COVID recovery needs assessment, this is an area when under a lot of pressure, this is an area that people could forget. So it's important to keep this particular linkage as well in the needs assessment. And you will see how all of these areas are cross-cutting, and they also link to the socio and economic sectors that Rita so well defined earlier and described. Next slide, please. So we have all of these various linkages. So how do you go about including these environmental issues in the either with nations or in international agencies? Basically, first one would be advocacy. Talking to various organizations, people in power. And when we talk about advocacy, it is important to highlight how the environmental issues that we are talking about here could have an impact. And if someone is looking at from an economic perspective, then the advocacy should include how the environmental impact will have an economic impact, so that they can actually picture the real impact coming out of the environmental cross-cutting issues, and so they will take that seriously. So there is a certain amount of advocacy, and in fact today this workshop is also meant for UNDP and UNDP officials and the counterparts in various countries who would be dealing with environmental COVID recovery needs assessment. And so this is also an example of advocacy. And inclusivity. Inclusivity is when dealing with various sectors, making sure that the environmental issues are included in that. And when we are involved in the recovery needs assessment, we make sure that these various sectors are linked and included. Scope broadening. Again, there are certain things like Rita pointed out in one of her last slides about how disaster risk reduction and environmental cross-cutting issues are important and crucial in this. And so when you have a particular cross-cutting sector, so one of the socioeconomic sector, for example, housing or a children's impact, livelihood, or gender impact, the internal displacement, for example, will likely have a disproportionate impact on the females, on women and children. And so if we can try and link these kinds of things, then we can broaden the scope and include those elements as well. So, and assess the linkages. How the assessing is, how crucial it is, how small or large the impact is. And so that's what we have to do. And then the last part of it is the needs assessment, which now Rita, next slide, please. Rita went through the various steps for the needs assessment. And so in this list there are 6 steps. I'll just go over quickly in the interest of time. Basically understanding the context and establishing a baseline, assessing the impacts of COVID pandemic, including estimation of losses, and then see what the government has already done so far. If the government has responded to a certain extent, then that will come into the calculation of what else is remaining in the recovery needs. That is step 4. And then based on that assessment, develop a set of recommendations on how to go about doing this recovery. And then the last part is the cost estimate. Next slide, please. So in order to help with all of this, we have created a tool, a baseline analysis template, and that will be shared by Paula to all the attendees today. What it does is it guides the user to consider all environmental linkages and it is easily adaptable as a team approach because we know that various sectors have got many people involved in this needs assessment, so it is easily adaptable. And then the documents source of information are, the references are provided. That also allows us to assign some kind of a confidence level of the data, because the lesser the confidence, then that means we have to ensure that there is more of a safety factor in our estimates. Next one. So in conclusion, the environmental linkages that I have outlined is a holistic approach to the COVID recovery needs assessment. The methodology that I talked about is aligned with the PDNA process, which is well established. The baseline analysis template is a user-friendly tool that we have created, and it has been used. This methodology actually has been used and applied by the Zambia team, and our next one of the presenters after mine will be talking about what their experience was in using this particular methodology. So that brings my presentation to the end. Thank you, Paula. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ravi. In the interest of time, we will go next to Eric. He's one of our speakers and will be presenting on the case study on Zambia. Eric has over 12 years of international experience. Eric Lobot, international experience at local, country, regional, and global levels in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean regions in DRR, disaster risk management, climate change, emergency preparedness and response. In his career, he's worked at different ranges of organizations such as French research institutions, NGOs, and UN agencies such as OCHA and UNDP. In September 2020, he joined UNDP's regional DRR team in the Resilience Hub in Nairobi, and he is covering East and Southern Africa. So Eric, I pass the floor to you so that you can present the case study in Zambia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. So I will, for this presentation, and as mentioned already by Ravi, I will take maybe a concrete example of the application of the methodology in the cooperation of the environment cross-cutting sector within a COVID-19 recovery needs assessments, which we have done in Zambia. So the process started in I think in April 2021, and we are now finalizing the whole report and the whole recovery strategy. It has been a bit delayed because of the election process, but now we are finally finalizing the whole exercise. It is also important to mention that this CRNA is expected also to inform the 8th National Development Plan, which is currently being drafted. I mean, I think that the first consultations with the different sectors are currently ongoing. So the CRNA, the recovery needs, and the recommendations should inform the next National Development Plan. Next slide, please. So just to start with a short, vague glimpse of the country for having some baseline data. So in terms of socioeconomic, so Zambia population is almost 18 million. Poverty, over 60% of the population live under the $2 per day. So you see GDP per capita. I will not go through all the different elements here, but I think it's important, especially for having some kind of context when we will go through the assessments of the COVID-19 impact on environment. Some elements on environment, and I think also the last, as you see, the main economic activities are agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, which are first activities that can have a high impact on environment, but also activities that rely a lot on natural resources. So important, that's to stress the importance of considering environment in such assessments. So some elements, so the protected area, almost 40% of the country is protected. Forest is a bit more for 74,000 square kilometers, which means more or less 10% of the country. And the rate of deforestation, almost 80,000 to 150,000 hectares per year. And you see also with the difference, I mean, is important, and that illustrates also the difficulty to monitor the deforestation in Zambia. In terms of pollution, use of chemicals for agriculture, as well as pollution from mining sector, that are the main two, the main important points and threat to in terms of pollution. And I'm adding a point here on the charcoal related activity, because it is important for what we will discuss in the next slides. So just to show the importance of this activity, 90% of the population is using charcoal. Of course, it's also a cause of deforestation, but as you will see, it is important for the environment assessment. Institutional arrangement, we have in Zambia two main institutions in charge of environment. So the Ministry of Water Management, Sanitation and Environmental Protection, which is the coordinating institution, and the Zambia Environmental Management Agency, ZEMA, which is the regulator. Next slide, please. So a brief overview of the COVID-19 situation. As you see here, the latest figures from WHO. So a bit more of 200,000 confirmed cases, almost 4,000 deaths. And you see here in the graphs, you see the three waves, which are characteristic in Africa. Each wave being higher than the previous one. So as you see, yes, in Zambia, in terms of socioeconomic impacts, GDP contraction has been estimated at 7.5%. Estimation of the impact on employment, so job losses between formal and informal employment, almost 500,000 jobs have been lost. And I think it's a moderate estimation. And poverty increased, so 3.5%. So I think those are really important thing to consider for the following slide. Next slide, please. On the impacts and effects on environments, this is, as mentioned between parentheses, this is assumptions, and because we had one of the main challenges, but I will get back to this later, was the lack of data, and this also illustrates different things that are important to discuss, but I will get back to this later. And as you see, we really based our assessment on the methodology that was presented by Ravi Shankar, and that was really key to address the different sectors and subsectors to look at with the government institutions. In terms of healthcare waste management, so the Earth Services, and during the different consultations we had with the Ministry of Health, they expressed that the health services were feeling the increase, and also and especially that not all health facilities have a full system for healthcare waste management, don't so have difficulties to absorb the increase, but no evidence and no measurement yet. So it's really difficult to have figures. In terms of deforestation, again, still no evidence, but the different discussions we had with the ministry and also other institutions, UNDP, country office, I mean, the first observation is that job losses conducted families to look for other source of energy, and easy to have, so wood, but also a new informal source of incomes. And that's why I was mentioning the importance of charcoal, and obviously obviously charcoal became an obvious source of informal income, which has an impact on deforestation. Land use, migration, this is something we discussed with UN Habitat. This is again an assumption, and there's no evidence. And I know that there are a few surveys that are currently being done to try to assess this kind of dynamic. But what the assumption is that because of the poverty increase, job losses, that we may assist to migration from to formal settlements, so an increase in such settlements, which will have an impact on environment, pressure on natural resources, but as also because of the lack of basic services such as water and sanitation, water contamination, and so on. So that's also something that has to be taken into consideration. Pollution, again, potential increase of informal mining due to job losses with no control on pollution. Water contamination, I was speaking about this on migration in the informal settlements, but also when we talk about mining, informal mining, this has also a huge impact on water. And finally, this is something we discussed with ZEMA, since they are the regulator, is the relaxation of environment standards for a speedy, as was explained by Ravi just before, for speedy economic recovery. This is something that ZEMA is already witnessing, and they are trying to get this, having a look at it. But this is one of the thing we have to mention and to stress in the recovery strategy, to take extreme careful to environmental standard and to respect. Next slide, please. Sorry. What the approach we have taken for integrating environment. Yeah, so the approach was based on the Syrian methodology, and we worked and we co-led the working group with key institutions and partners on the field, data collection, consultations with key stakeholders, and integration. And within this report, there is one chapter on environment and disaster risk reduction. And we are working currently for finalizing the whole report, to work with the main writer to integrate key elements for building back better in the different sector, in the different chapters. Next slide, please. And I think that will be the last one. I think important in terms of lessons learned and the main challenges. The methodology that was presented by Ravi just before was really key to really frame and address the whole different kind of impacts, and we had to look at with the institutions. Again, I am a disaster risk reduction specialist, not an environment specialist, so that was key for framing the whole approach and bringing some coherence for the assessment. But I think also that they were finalizing the methodology, and it takes time to really look at, accompany, and especially related to my second point, which is the virtual assessment. And it was really challenging to do such assessment, keep motivation, and bring all the partners together while everything being virtual without any in-country mission. That was really challenging. 2 cross-cutting sectors in one chapter, considering all what I've just presented, it was really challenging to address disaster risk reduction and environment in one single chapter, even if it was also an opportunity to bring some linkages and coherence between both, because environment and disaster risk reduction are really, really related with also climate change. So it was also an opportunity, a challenge, but an opportunity. And finally, this is something I was mentioning, and again, everything is really assumptions at that point, but the lack of data. Environment, and in the last response plan that was developed by the national, the DMMU, the Disaster Management and Mitigation Units, together with the Ministry of Health, they develop a response plan, and the section on the impacts on the non-earth sector and how to address it. Within this sector, this section, sorry, the environment is not even mentioned. So this illustrates also that environment is definitely not a priority at that moment, which can be understandable considering the socioeconomic impact. But I think this is something that has been impacting also for really measuring the recovery needs and propose proper recommendations so the first recommendation we had with the chapter is to do a proper assessment and to understand, and especially as Rita was mentioning, that environment and the environment degradation and the building back better, building back greener can be also an opportunity in terms of economic growth, sustainable development, and a creation of job, and also shifting from a carbon intensive economy to a more sustainable economy. I think this is my last slide, but yeah, thank you for your attention, and happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much, Eric. Apologies for that, but we are running a bit out of time, so let's just go straight into the Q&A session. Thank you again, all the speakers, for these high quality presentations. As a reminder, I would like to ask all attendees to keep your cameras and microphones muted, and for speakers to turn on your cameras and start addressing the questions. I think we have a few of them on the chat box. So let me start off by addressing a question to Mr. Murli Tumarakudi. Because of time, we couldn't go very much in depth into the South Africa case study. However, we have some questions that address the high level dialogue and how can we look into incorporating these environmental issues into international frameworks. So perhaps you have the global vision. We have a question from Sejuti, which is referring to that the world has failed to achieve a single Aichi biodiversity target by 2020, and there's now a drafting process with a deadline of 2050. So minor reporting requirements by 2030. So basically there is a lack of urgency when it comes to environmental or biodiversity concern at the global level. So the question is, how can we make sure that these we can integrate some green concerns and recovery plans at the international framework and create some urgency when it comes to these?
Thank you, Paula, and good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to the viewers from around the world. I think there are two separate questions within it. One is, how can we create international framework in which environment is integrated? I think this part is comparatively easy. We already have number of international frameworks. We have number of international environmental frameworks, and we have a number of processes where the mainstreaming is ongoing. As Rita explained, we have the post-disaster needs assessment, which I know as early as 2008 has been integrating environmental concerns in post-disaster situation. We have a similar post-conflict needs assessment process. We have the international recovery platform based in Kobe, where for many decades we have been trying to work together, all the UN agencies, European Commission, World Bank, others, in recovery, and environment is always firmly embedded. So it is really not shortage of global agreements or processes which is the issue. But the second part is a reality that the world is not showing sufficient urgency to this issue. This, as you know, is case of most environmental issues, including the most defining an environmental issue, but not only an environmental issue, defining global issue, which is climate change. The latest IPCC report also says that the climate is not that going to change, it has already changed. The change is accelerating and probably accelerating at a pace faster than we are adapting to it. So indeed, there's a need for urgency. The only thing I could say at this point of time, having worked in this area for the last 20 years, and as much as frustrated as you are about the lack of progress, is that if there's one thing which COVID has taught, it is that when individuals, societies, and countries actually feel threatened by a crisis, they can act. They can act at an individual level, they can act as a society, they can act as a community, even without having an international convention on coordinating action or setting a target or anything like that. So it is my hope that some of the lessons which we learned from COVID, that when an issue is clearly communicated to the community, it is right in their front, they can act decisively and accept changes, financial burden, which when you look back, it's not proportional, but people are accepting those challenges. Thank you. Back to Paula.
Thank you very much, Merle. Again, a reminder to please keep your microphones muted so that we don't hear background noise. Up next, we have a couple of questions that were directed at Mike when it comes to the informal recycling sector. And I would like to directly mention both to you, Mike. The first one is regarding international aid by member states. It's the Pranav is asking whether international aid has engaged directly with this informal waste sector, or are they mainly focused on health and risk when it comes to health, and they haven't actually looked into helping that sector or the informal sector? And the second question is, what are the possibilities of including informal sector in crisis waste management?
Okay. Paula, thank you very much indeed for those questions. The question relating to international aid and the level of interaction with the informal sector, I would say from my personal knowledge, it's limited, to say the least, partly because some of the factors that we mentioned, the difficulties with identifying or communicating with the informal sector. But that said, they have in recent years become far more visible, far more organized and proactive with some of the bodies that I mentioned at the start of my presentation. So they are becoming more organized, they are developing a platform and having a voice. That said, from my own personal experience, where the international development and aid community are interacting with governments, I do know of a number of success stories. Some come to mind, one in Guyana in South America, when the Inter-American Development Bank were building a new landfill site for Georgetown. I was involved in that, and we made it part of the project implementation strategy that we engaged with, listened to, and very much had the informal sector represented at the decision-making and the implementation stage. And the outcome of that is just one small example, is when the new landfill site was built, it was built with formal provisions for the recyclers. They were provided with an area of the site to do their waste picking, waste sorting. They were provided with shower and sanitary facilities, and they had a voice in terms of ongoing dialogue and monitoring of the site's activity as a component of the broader community. Again, other work I've done in the Caribbean, again in the waste sector, developing landfill sites in St. Lucia. Again, I personally ensured that the informal sector was part of the process and were catered for in terms of the development. So they're just two small examples drawing from my own experience. I'd say generally there's a lot more work to be done though, in terms of making sure the informal sector have a voice and are heard. The second one, in terms of are there opportunities for the informal sector to be involved in the COVID waste recovery? I would say absolutely there are opportunities. We've heard and we know that throughout the developing world, many of the waste management services are already being provided by the informal sector. They're a willing workforce, they're experienced. What would need to be done, again, is to open dialogue to engage with them. But I'd say the key thing is to make sure that the informal sector themselves are educated, and the employer, whether it's the government, federal or municipality, make sure that their health and safety is catered for in the provision of PPE and indeed in training. But absolutely, I do see that they have a role in managing COVID-related waste. Absolutely. Thank you, and back to you, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Up next, perhaps to Ravi. Again, I would like to remember to the audience that I've provided a link to a folder in Dropbox where you can access all the materials that we have been mentioning throughout the webinar, the methodology, and the baseline analysis. And perhaps with that, I will link with Ravi and ask you, because obtaining data sometimes can be a challenge in certain contexts and certain countries, can you tell us what if we don't have good information available on these environmental linkages that you were mentioning, on the methodology, and what is the purpose of having the confidence in that data ranking that you're mentioning? So the quality of the data and what's the importance of it, and how can we solve that issue?
Okay, thank you. See, as Murali, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, as Murali mentioned, a lot of things. In a crisis, people can come together. There is a certain amount of urgency to put together information. But at the same time, they have to rely on information that is already out there in order to gather that information. And sometimes when they go gather that information, they recognize that it is not exactly what you need, or it may be missing some important parts. So it is still important to take advantage, because we don't have time to plan a study and get the information through normally acceptable, scientifically rigorous methods. We have to rely on information that already exists. And when that happens, we don't know how well it sort of fits with our goal. So that is why in our template that we created, we not only identified a spot for putting in the reference for the source of that information, but also as the sector leads and the team members start looking at this information, if they feel that the data is not really accurate, or less accurate than what is desirable, then you can put in a ranking of 1 to 5 on the confidence in the data. Now, that confidence assessment is completely subjective, and it is subjective and subjected to the understanding and knowledge of the person who is evaluating at that time. So it is still useful to get some kind of a ranking in terms of level of confidence. Now, if the confidence level is high, then you can take that information without much of a change and then use that in order to do your estimates. But if the confidence is low on something, then the principles of uncertainty can be applied. And when you have a low confidence data, then you need to increase the factor of safety or the multiplying factor in your estimate. So the estimate is going to be slightly larger because the confidence level is low. So that is the reason why we have aligned it in this way. And understanding that it is very subjective, it is still something that allows the evaluator to identify the source of information and identifying the accuracy of the data.
Okay, very well, Ravi. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions that are asking about Africa. So perhaps I'll ask this to Eric, seeing that you have some experience in Zambia, but as well in your job, you're also covering a certain number of countries in the African context. So a couple of people, actually the same person, Armand, is wondering two things. He raised the question of what has UNDP or UNEP, in this case UNDP, work in the Central African countries. Specifically, he's worried about pollution, the rise in pollution that has been linked to COVID. So if we have provided any advice, or if you have any advice on how to deal with that aspect. But as well, countries like Cameroon, where biodiversity is really threatened, he is wondering what are the projects that UNDP or UNEP has been taken, and how can we bring the environmental issues to the table, and how can we bring this into governments and states and be like, you know, biodiversity is important and it cannot be at the back seat of the plans, it has to be at the forefront. So how can you address that challenge in these countries?
Thank you, Paula. And unfortunately for Cameroon and Central Africa, those are, I mean, not the regions I'm currently covering. So I may not, my reply may not be specifically on those countries, since I don't have information on those ones. But I know that, yes, we are working and I mean, in relation with COVID, and also how we can address it and make this kind of important issues and cross-cutting and the impact on environment important, especially to make it as a priority, or at least something very important to address by the government. We are working, yes, with UNEP and also UNDP, and I will let maybe you, Murali, are speaking for UNEP, but yes, I mean, again, what we are facing a lot in the different countries, we are supporting the government in assessing the impact and knowing the impact of environment on environment, is that, again, the lack of data, the lack of interest for environment, since this is a response to disaster, and mainly the government doesn't think that environment is that important, which is a mistake, but this is the thing. But I think that such assessment can also guide the government for the next, and this is why I was mentioning it for Zambia. They are in the process of developing their next national development plan. The recovery needs assessment, and the recovery, any assessment of the recovery is also our responsibility to bring the environment and to guide, even if we don't have a proper picture of the impact on environment, but really to guide the government to address and to look at and to assess and to look at what is important, and to make, in terms of advocacy, it's an excellent advocacy tool. It's an excellent work that is done, and also because we are working and addressing different sectors, working with different sectors, and addressing the building back greener. So which means also that we are trying to show as an example how we can incorporate environment, not only in 1 and 3 points, which is the environment chapter, but also in the different sector, transversally, horizontally, in the different sector, to build resilience. So this is our approach, how we try to look at, to bring in a resilience perspective. So horizontally, through such assessment, advocacy, supporting governments in doing also in different projects. But yeah, this is more or less, and again, I'm disaster risk reduction specialist, so I'm not really specialist and following up and having more information. We have other teams looking at environments, but yeah, this is at least what I'm working on.
Very well, thank you. I hope that answered the question. I have a couple of more questions to wrap it up, as I see we are reaching now the time. One might be addressed both to UNEP, so perhaps Murali can take this one, or Mike, and UNDP, because it's general. The question is whether if it's possible for low-income countries to consult UN for crisis waste management, mainly medical waste, and what are the possibilities of assistance that we can provide as the United Nations? So perhaps I pass the floor to Murali.
Thank you, Paula. In terms of the services of the United Nations, it's always, there's no cost attached to it. So all countries, regardless of their income, are free and welcome to contact. The primary contact in case of disaster waste management is the UNEP OCHA Joint Environment Unit. We'll put the contact of that in the chat and also in the conference report. And they can be contacted. There are a range of services we do, such as providing training, such as providing technical assistance, and such as providing emergency response in a crisis situation. So yes, such services are available. They are available free of charge. So feel free to contact and we will address them as they come. Thank you.
Perhaps Eric, if you want to contribute to that, or
I also just support exactly what Murali has just said, and I saw your your message in the chat. So yes, this is especially for government. We are always intervening in the request of the government, and we have country offices in almost for UNDP, but also UNEP regional presence. So we definitely can support through a request by a government.
Okay, very well. I think with that, the final question that I have on my inbox, it was directed to Rita, but because Rita unfortunately had to leave the workshop early on because of the technical issues, I will open up the floor to whoever wants to take this one. And it's how is the best way of reskilling and moving towards the greening sectors? So perhaps if you can provide some inputs on how can we do that reskilling, so providing more skills and moving towards some more greening sector side.
I'm happy to take this question unless Eric want to take it.
No, please, Mori. I can add if, but yeah, please.
Okay.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It's a question going a lot more broader than post-crisis and post-COVID. But post-COVID and post-crisis is a good opportunity to reflect on this topic. I think about 10 years back, the concept of green economy came into being, and there has been realization that one could create a lot more job per unit investment if countries were to think creatively. For example, if you have to invest $100 million in oil and gas, if you look at the number of jobs one would create, and then compare that with $100 million in solar energy, and then see the number of jobs it will create. If I recall correctly, I don't have the numbers on the top of my head now, but it is about 50 times as much. So you can create a lot more green jobs with the same investment and achieve the same end objective of energy provision. But this will also need the world to have a lot more effort at creating a labor force which has these green skills. But in a world where online education has become the norm and we have many ways of delivering knowledge, reskilling is not a big challenge as it was thought to be before COVID. Before COVID, the world was wondering how would we train hundreds of millions of people in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, where many skills are getting redundant. Does developing countries have the type of physical infrastructure needed to deliver those training? How will Africa train its 1 billion people who are emerging? But COVID has taught us that you can train hundreds of millions of people, reaching a lot more at fraction of a cost, often at no cost. So there are going to be new ways of training. The training is already happening. International Labour Organization in its training center is already designing courses for green jobs, and there are others as well. And every university, every online platform will start to create these green jobs. So there are ways in which courses are being created, and there are online ways in which it can be delivered to millions of people. And we are very confident that as the green economy pick up, the labor force will as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murli. I see that we have overpassed the webinar by 5 minutes, so perhaps it is time to wrap this session and finalize this Q&A. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this workshop, both speakers and attendees. And we have really tried to provide some guidance and some lessons learned on how to integrate these environmental issues into COVID-19 recovery planning. Again, you have all the resources and the video recording of the session. We will provide it in that link that I shared before in the chat. We hope that all of this was useful information and we provided some good insights, and that we will have some positive impact for all of you out there. So with these, again, thank you all for attending, and I will wish you all the best. Stay safe and stay healthy. And with this, we finalize today's workshop. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.